Well, to begin a story, you got to begin where it started for me, right? When I started questioning it, so that you kind of begin to understand how I started to get involved in this. I came home. I've been away for a long time, getting my law degree and just getting my colonial education. And I came to a chapter in my new book, Nationhood Interrupted, about land. And my memory of land was fuzzy. So I thought, I have to go home. I can't write a chapter on land when the memory of it wasn't clear. So I put my things in storage. I came home, and what I came home to, I was stunned. I was stunned. The land has changed so much that I couldn't even, in my memory, the fresh water streams that had been there were gone. They were devastated, contaminated. I was shocked. I had been away about 15, 20 years, and I even went looking for the cabin that we lived in when we go hunting in the winter and the different times, and even that was burnt down. And I asked my dad what happened, who burnt this down, and he said it was CERM, Saskatchewan Environment, or DNR as they were called, Department of Natural Resources at the time. And he said DNR had been going around burning down the hunting cabins. And so that what motivated me to begin asking questions, and I was seeing that the trees were being removed. And I started asking Saskatchewan Environment, what is going on here? And we started meeting with them, and they told us that the Indianak chief, the chiefs of the three reserves called Witchkin Lake, Pelican Lake, Big River Reserve, under agency chiefs, tribal council called AC Forestry, were consenting on our behalf without ever talking to the title holders or the hunting peoples that these trees were going to be taken. So we started meeting with Saskatchewan Environment and telling them we were not being notified. We were not being told that this destruction was consented on our behalf. And then during one of the meetings last year in September, it was identified there was a conflict of interest. But Saskatchewan Environment is still moving ahead with the activities and the removing of trees. There was a conflict of interest happening on so many levels with AC Forestry that I'm stunned that the trees are still being taken. In fact, it's increased. The activity has increased. The question here is, the chiefing councils, do they have the authority and jurisdiction to consent for hunters and trappers and people who are protected by Treaty 6? Do they have the authority to consent on our behalf off reserve to lands that extend into our hunting lands on all of Treaty 6? And I don't think they do, but Saskatchewan Environment is acting as if they are. And the other thing here that's an issue is we never are extinguished our right over the resources. If you look at the treaty documents and the treaty discussions and dialogue, nowhere in there does it say we gave up the resources. The resources were silent. And if you look at colonial law, when something is silent, it's never given up. It's never extinguished. So the resources, the jurisdiction and authority over resources still reside with the Indigenous people. And within my nation, the Nihio people, the jurisdiction and authority over land and water reside with the women, because we carry the water ceremonies and the land ceremonies. And there's a disturbing trend happening under the Indian Act. The Indian Act is an imposed system of governance and leadership. We never consented to that. We never consented to that structure of leadership, and yet this is what the colonial government wants to sit with and meet with constantly. And when you take a look at that leadership structure, it's problematic to begin with, because the oppression that they have to function under in terms of the funding that they get impacts their position in that power structure. The government has so much more power. All of Treaty 6 is unceded, unsurrendered land. And a lot of colonial people, the settlers, don't know their treaty history enough to know that none of the treaties are unfinished business. They're unfinished business. There are things that are not implemented fully under those treaty terms and promises, and this colonial government is acting under their presumed sovereignty with the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is very much utilized every time we've gone to court to try and assert the treaties, except it's disguised and called as the underlying title of the Crown.
What's the message to people? How can people rally? What can they do?
I think the biggest thing that they can do is stand with Indigenous people, get themselves informed about climate change and how the boreal forest is being impacted. And part of climate change is the deforestation that's happening, and the boreal forest being affected by it because the heat is increasing globally. It's affecting the growth of the trees in the boreal forest. Even if they do the logging right now today, the destruction is generational. Mm-hmm. It's generational. In my lifetime, I'm not going to see those trees come back. Maybe in my grandchildren's. But with the rate that the heat is increasing, it's going to stunt the growth of the trees because they're impacted by the lack of water that's being distributed onto the land. And also, we're seeing more and more insects, that there's an explosion of them because they're not dying off the way that they naturally would during the winter. And the other thing that I'm noticing out on the land is that the things that were readily available 5-10 years ago in terms of the medicines that we need, in terms of our health, we're having to search further and longer. They're more difficult to find. And also, the wood tick. We see the wood tick in the southern part of Saskatchewan and in the Treaty 4 lands, but they're moving further and further north. Again, that's impacting how we move on the earth into the forest to get at the animals and the fishing and the water. Even the water is impacted when you take the trees because there's no shade and there's no moisture being kept to the land. And when you take the trees, you're taking the shade, and it impacts the waterways. And we're seeing less and less, fresh water streams flourishing because of the clear cutting.